Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about industry. So let's get into it. So the question in question is, hi Frederick, what's your take on the current tech bubble slash the industry situation? Do you have any thoughts, any fears or hopes, any advice for how one might possibly deal with this when working in tech? Particularly when currently trying to enter and not yet having found a place or build up a solid foundation to stand upon, to elevate one's self above the ones that might not make it, should such a pop arrive and results in layoff, industry-wide scale downs and other such trouble. So what you're basically asking me is, it seems, how do you deal with job security in an unstable market or in some type of unstable economy? So I've had this question a few times before, and it's always a flavor of the same thing. How do I future-proof my career? And the thing which I think is a very good thing to remember in general, is how I'm not an economist or anything like that, guys, but I'll give you an example of the sort of considerations that are worth if we're talking the basics of the basics when we're talking about markets and like how they're doing and so forth. Usually, you can think of markets in a basic scenario as either it's a self-sustaining market, it's actually generating its own wealth. An example of that would be, oil, gold, like resources, things like that. It doesn't have to be that, public services or things like medicine, etc., etc. We're talking about an industry that is going to be a driving part of the economy. The value of these services and goods might not always be as high, but they're always going to be there. It's not something that's going to go away because it's a human need to, say, have food, or it's a human need to have access to natural resources. But then you have other markets who are not sustainable in terms like they don't generate their own wealth. They are catering to a different market. An example of that would be, say, the service industry, well, to a certain point, right? Or industries that are they're only sustainable, as I like to say, by borrowing money from another market. They're completely dependent on the other market. So if you think in those terms, IT has a lot of that going on as well, where you have some tech that is because you're, as a digital person, you can sell digital services and you can sell consulting hours, etc., etc. But what really matters is that you sort of understand that the IT industry, like the need for digital goods and competence, is universal. You can work in, like, as I said, in the first market, where you're dealing with systems that are completely that cater to a market that is self-sustaining, or you can work in a market where you're sort of you're catering to other good, it's a different type of market where you don't necessarily have the same sort of job stability, or if the market goes sour, as an example. I mean, guys, there are so many startups, just as if we're just talking the silly examples now, that would fail today if there was a recession. They would most of them would disappear, because the product that they are producing is a nice to have. It's experimental. It's something that isn't established. It's not a way of life that is going to be sustainable if people really are concerned with saving on cost. It's a cost that only they will be willing to sort of deal with and pay for during a period where they feel like they have extra cash. But I mean, every single person needs water. That's a silly analogy, or it's a very big oversimplification, but I hope you understand. But the people who are maintaining our water, they have computers, just as the people who have, I don't know, Facebook for dogs have a good time with the programs that are being built. So you, as the software developer, like the person who's working in digital services, if the market changes, the only thing that really should concern you is whether or not you have the skills necessary to work in the various industries. And if we talk about demand for digital competence and so forth, the strongest role that you can possibly have is software developer. It is the water. It's the water role. It is the gold standard. It's the thing that makes IT. Without the nothing whatsoever would happen in the digital landscape without the software developer. It is the lowest unit of a worker that you can have. If we now assume if we forget about the hardware and so forth, but like the actual digital systems that are being made, which means that if you want to have the highest job security, that is the perfect role for you. Manager, not so much. PO, not so much. Like all these other roles, guys, you don't really think about it maybe so much when you are a software developer, because it's sort of like being a person. You don't understand that it's I like to say that it's a reverse pyramid. Everything stands and falls on the fact that you know how to write code. Nothing else matters if that's not happening. It is like the river that you get your water from to water your crops. And the other roles, like the QAs, like the POs, the managers, exactly, like their entire, like all of that stuff is irrelevant if you are not there to do the job. They are there and they have a meaningful role and everybody is doing their part. But in a recession, the last thing that you get rid of is usually the software developers. You will have to get rid of some of them, but as I said, the needs for digital services might not go in your they're never going to go away completely, because it's such a universal thing. It's so ingrained into the IT age that if you know what you're doing, you're usually going to find another job somewhere, because usually in a recession, yes, there's a lot of layoffs and so forth, and it might not be as lucrative a market anymore, but the need is still there. It really depends on how much of a recession are we talking about, or how much instability are there. So the tips that I can give you in terms of skills, like concrete areas of software development that you can look into, that are basically always going to be there. At least I can't imagine a situation where it's like we would have to work in a very, very different way. But it's going to be back-end development, front-end development, and then of course full-stack development, operations, and security work. These areas are evergreen. These are the most in the IT landscape. There is nothing more stable than these areas. There are other things that you could be doing, but these are, I can say, these are the core, the gold standard is, as I said, back and front end, and like application development, because that's the lifeblood of everything. Security I usually include, because although that is not necessarily the same thing as software development, because creating the thing is usually more valuable in many cases than securing it. It's getting less true, that statement, because we're finding that digital warfare and we're getting to a point where we actually have a lot of existing systems that are very vulnerable, and we sort of realize that the growth of IT has gone to the point where we have a lot of catching up to do when it comes to securing our information and so forth. But these are the areas that you can look at, and then everything else sort of comes down to, when you talk about a bubble popping or like a recession or something like that, like which industries are you in? And in many cases, if it's the same deal as if it's like a boom somewhere, the people who get shuffled away are usually the low quality software developers, or like the low quality IT professionals, the freelancers, or like people who work at like smaller projects. They're like bootcamp level developers, etc., and the people who stay are the real professionals, the people who are very, very good. And I mean, if it goes, depending on how much of a recession, then yeah, even these people might find it difficult to find employment as readily, but there's nothing you can do about that, because as I said, then it's not a question of whether or not you are valuable, because as a software developer you're always going to be as valuable as you can be when it comes to software, when it comes to IT. It's sort of like, then in such a gigantic recession, the only things that would matter anymore is like the farmer. That's the person who would be the richest person in like an almost apocalyptic type of event, right? So what I want you to take away from this is that my personal opinion about tech and bubbles and all of that stuff is very simple. I don't see much changing. If there is a recession, the thing that usually happens will probably happen again, which is that the markets that have no self-generating value in of themselves, they are basically just these sort of, I'm not saying luxury items, because luxury items do have a value, but there are markets that and products that are more like nobody's going to pump money into those markets if there's a recession, and so they're mostly going to fail because they are quote unquote dependent on other markets or other industries in order to make their money. And whereas there are markets that are very, very stable and basically self-generating. An example, as I said, is like natural resources is a silly one. And for IT, it's the same sort of deal. It really depends on where you're working in a recession and so forth and so forth. For us software developers, the most stable roles that we can have is backend, front-end, ops, security, these sorts of roles. These are the people who are usually making up the bulk of a digital product or any digital services that we have. And if you can't find a job as one of those, it's either because you don't have the skills usually, so it's very important that you actually do invest in your own education, because that is at the end of the day what it's all about, or it is because a possible recession or like something like that would be so severe that we're talking about now the only people who have a job whatsoever are the people who are critical to the infrastructure of the country, or like of something where we're talking about a depression level of thing. And it's, I mean, you cannot foolproof yourself against that, short of, I don't know, owning some land with solar panels and a well somewhere. That's something you could invest in with your developer money if you really want to make sure that, even the apocalypse isn't a big deal to you. Have a great day.